All right, here we are. Dr. John, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Awesome. Okay, so today we're going to have a discussion about the weakened immune type. And I'm excited to talk to you about that today because it's so robust, right? I mean, it's so impactful when we talk about the specific symptoms and what makes up a weakened immune type. So we can give our insight on that and discuss, what it is, how to determine if you have it, and most importantly, what to do about it. So, yeah, why don't we start with just some of the symptoms? What are you seeing with the most common symptoms with the weak immune type?
Yeah, so those are people right out of the gate. If somebody has a autoimmune issue, they're diagnosed with this XYD condition, or they have some type of chronic degenerative disorder. That a lot of times is a telltale that they may be a weak immune type. Although some of the other types that we've talked about can have impacts into that. Other things that we see is just usually the typical symptoms: brain fog, chronic fatigue aspects, chronic pain components, but then also different things that can give you insights that there is demand on the body where you are burning through antioxidants, glutathione, things of that nature at a higher rate. So when people that a lot of times have fallen to that weakened immune state or weakened immune genetic type are the people that age quicker than they should. You see a lot of people that have issues in their peroxidation pathways, so they start graying at an early age. Those are a lot of things that I typically see. What about you? What are the things that you kind of see with the weakened immune response?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the same thing you were going to say is that when you think about what the immune system does to the body, it just upregulates your demand to put out the fires. That's what I always say, is that you got a lot of fires in the body. Yep. And you don't have enough firefighters. And as a result, you're going to have that peroxidation over the body in weakened joints, graying of the hair, things like that. So, but I was also looking through what we had included in our mini course, and there's some other things that you put in there as well, John. Mentioning the gallbladder problems, wink, wink. And talking about also with swelling, fatty liver, sensitive to supplements. So maybe give us an insight on how you came up with those pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, just because a lot of times you hear, for instance, you talk about the sensitive to supplements, sensitive medication components. A lot of times that's going to be somebody that is a toxic accumulator or somebody that is a weakened immune response, because a lot of times the weakened immune genetic type, the toxic accumulation genetic type, a lot of that deals with glutathione production, deals with peroxidation pathways in terms of how our body can control and clear inflammation. So when somebody has a lot of genetic weakness there, you're going to see a lot of the stories. So if somebody comes into me and hear this every single week, I was like, I can't take supplements, I can't tolerate them. It's like right out of the gate, I know it's like this weak immune genetic type story is possibly going to be a piece of the puzzle. And genetically, I expect to see the genes that have fallen into that weak immune genetic type. I see those genes that are most likely going to be the players in the story when we look at their genetic reports.
Yeah, and so let's talk about our course, because I think a lot of people aren't taking advantage of that. They go to obviously yourgenetictype.com and they go to the free resource where they take the 7 mini course, which I think we're almost finished too, John. We just have to clean it up a little bit. Just a quiz, so they can ultimately take a quiz and it will point to what genetic type they are. Right. And then what we've done is we've included in the unlocked course the actual gene SNPs, so that when they get their genetic type, when they pinpoint what it is their genetic type is, then they can go and look at the genes to see if it corroborates that and says that. And I think we got to give a little bit of or a lot of recognition to Dr. Bob Miller, who came up with the genetic pyramid, and we've kind of bent it for our own purposes. But one of the solutions we talk about with the weakened immune type is ultimately slowing down the mast cell activation, right? And the inflammatory response. So I think that's a good area for us to talk about in terms of, you know, how much of the weakened immune type is being impacted by just the mast cell activation, and what is mast cell activation? I think that's a good topic to talk about.
Yeah. So, when you're talking about mast cells in itself, a lot of times there's a lot of correlation to histamine and histamine only with that, but it goes so much deeper than that. Mast cells, I call them, I kind of like, when I explain them, I kind of call them, especially when we're talking about it in relation to histamine, they're kind of like cells that kind of come in and mop things up. All right. And they're going to kind of store that. And then when the body recognizes that there's a stress again, it'll release those chemicals back into the system. And that in itself is needed, but it can be problematic if the body is sensitive and it does that too rapidly, and if it does it too frequently. Okay. Because you want those chemicals there, but you don't want them in copious amounts too often, because that in itself can be problematic. So when you're talking about the weakened immune side of things, and it deals with immune function and mast cell stories, or mast cell activation, things of that nature, a lot of it comes down to how sensitive one's immune response is to the environment. And it's, we always kind of talk about, there's this kind of loss of tolerance to chemicals, loss of tolerance to the environment, that causes your immune system and things like the mast cells to become a little bit more sensitive than they should be to the things around you, which then can be problematic and kind of re-release some of those, chemicals back into the system that really kind of just burn things out and can lead to a lot of the chronic issues that you have.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, though, do get that wrong too, John, right? I mean, in terms of if we do talk about one of our 7 genetic types as being the pure histamine type, and they identify themselves as people that have allergies and itchiness, and they don't do well around pets, or there's certain foods and they're sensitive to everything. But that's not the only reason people are going to have some instances of histamine issues, right? I mean, obviously stress,
right,
and also the environment and foods and the immune system as well. But I think the other side of the story is, with the weakened immune system, would you say it's a continuum in terms of, because I know you deal with people that are really sick, just like I do. And we see a lot of people will say, well, I don't get sick very often, right? So is that sort of a continuum of, we're at the left side of the scale where you have an overactive immune system, and ultimately at some point the ball is going to come down, right? I mean, let's kind of talk about that.
Yeah. So if you're just kind of reflecting, if you got somebody who's got chronic issues, but they never get a cold or flu and they haven't for years. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Sometimes, like especially with the kids that I work with, right? If that's a question I ask every single parent. It's in my paperwork. It's like, how often does your kid get sick? And it's a lot of times like they kind of like want to brag and be like, my kid never gets sick. And I'm like, oh no, I'm like, that's not a good thing, because the natural response of our body is to build immunity to our environment. So you want symptoms to happen. It's about balance. It's like, you don't want to be sick all the time. Like every single month you're having a cold or something, or symptoms, but it's something that you don't want to go, 10 years of your life and have no symptom response to anything that you've ever been exposed to. So a lot of times if somebody has a scenario where they never get sick, it's almost like, it's like it's almost like an autoimmune aspect. It's like your immune system is so ramped up that it's attacking its own tissues, most likely, that it is so resilient to anything and everything that it never manifests symptoms. And like I said, it's only a matter of time for you take that next step over the edge, and everything really starts spiraling downward. So when you're talking about immune aspects like that, it is about balance. You want a normal immune response, and people that never get sick like that may not be an issue. But a lot of times the patients I see, if they got other chronic issues, they're coming to see me and they're saying that they never pick up a cold or a flu bug or anything on those lines, that is problematic, that their immune system is not operating the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, and I think, like, just to summarize, so we're talking about, hey, I may never get sick, but I don't notice that actually is I'm not going to go to the doctor, right, if I never get sick, right? I mean, it's usually I got something else going on where, I do feel old, I feel like my joints are breaking down, or I have brain fog, And then when we're talking about the weakened immune type, where, hey, we know there's a genetic component. We know that you guys are overwhelmed with looking at your gene SNPs. You know there's something called MTHFR, but you really don't know how to put all those puzzle pieces together. And then we talk about there's this type where you look at these particular genes, and you have these particular genes, and now you're on a continuum of you never get sick. And that could be a bad thing too. You're always sick, and you're always weakened, and you're always depleted. So I guess if I'm listening to this, it's like, okay, I'm confused now, right? Like what does that mean? So how do we as practitioners go about, like, okay, well, let's unravel the ball of yarn for you and kind of give you an idea as to why you are the weakened immune type, and what kind of genes, what are the actual gene SNPs too that we see in this particular gene, in this particular genetic type?
Yeah, so there's a handful of genes. There's genes that deal with peroxidation pathways, that deal with like iron regulation, that deal with glutathione recycling or glutathione peroxidation components, SOD, catalase. Those, the CBS gene, which a lot of times maybe people have heard of that because it's kind of another buzzworthy genes. Those kind of fall into the weakened immune response. But I usually kind of really cluster this weak immunotype into two stories. A lot of it falls into that whole relationship between mTOR and autophagy, and if you don't know what that means, we're going to explain it here in a second, as well as NRF2 activation and that KEAP1 gene, which we've kind of talked about previously, is kind of one of those deal breaker aspects, and how the body can recognize that there is a need to fight the fight. Okay. And so the first story that we look at with the genetic side of things, deals with that balance between how our immune system or how our body is doing one of two things. It's either going to make new cells, or it's going to get into a state where it's going to go into self-preservation and try and kill off or clean out sick and infected cells. Okay. And when people fall this weak immune type, they a lot of times get stuck in one of those other stories. I think of kind of a teeter-totter. All right. And we talk about, basic like polar shifts in immune function, things of that nature. This whole cell replication aspect is kind of like a teeter-totter, and people that get into this weak immune, or that fall into the weak immune genetic type, that teeter-totter gets stuck on one side or the other. And we want balance. You want to be able to go up and go down, and then you want to come back to balance at some point. So the body is either going to be making new cells, or the body's going to be trying to kill off or clean out sick and infected cells. All right. And what happens is when somebody gets stuck in one way or the other, and that's where they live all the time, that in itself is going to put a stress on the immune system. It's going to set them up for a higher likelihood for autoimmune diseases to manifest themselves. It's going to lead to the chronic symptoms that they're experiencing. And there are genetic factors of why people get stuck in one of those sides or the other. Okay. So that's a big factor that I see. And we talk about autophagy. Autophagy is that process of killing off or cleaning out those sick cells. And there are specific genes that correlate to autophagy. And I've seen a lot of people that have immune issues that have these, post-chronic viral aspects. They have chronic Lyme, and genetically, it's like on these autophagy genes, it's like they're a mess. They've got a lot of variants, and it's like their body never recognizes that they have these infections, and these cells are infected with viruses and Lymes and never going to work, killing that or cleaning that out. So all they're doing is making new cells, and they're not worrying about cleaning out the damaged cells. And all they're doing is reinfecting the new cells they have and wondering why they're not getting any better. Okay. So that's a big thing that I see with people with weak immune. And I'm sure you see the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, hey, that's huge. I mean, it's the example I use is, and I think maybe you told me this or someone else, there's a good chance that if it's an example I'm using, you told me it. So, but as far as like going to the, the junkyard and just using the spare parts to be able to reuse them again. And, we've talked about this initially when we were promoting the MTHFR crash course, where when we're coming out with eating right for your genetic type, we also talked about that autophagy. You think about, like, you take pictures of the 1970s and you see people that are, a lot skinnier, and everyone was svelte and, looked good. And now it's just, you have sort of a whole nation of obesity. And I don't think that's just coming down to certain foods that they're eating, but it's the fact that, you know, the environmental triggers that can signal the mTOR. But what I was gonna mention too is that as part of the weakened immune health, when we're looking at the gene SNPs that support the immune system and support autophagy and support mTOR, one of the things that I think we should talk about is how MTHFR and the actual methylation cycle play into that, John, because I guess I'm finding now, like, some of my biggest train wrecks are not only the ones that have epigenetic factors like Lyme and mold and heavy metals and stuff like that, but also have those antioxidant gene SNPs like, you know, NRF2, KEAP1, SOD, catalase, the sirtuin enzymes. But then on top of that, making matters worse is the fact that they do have these methylation basic SNPs as well. Like, they're just a train wreck where they're not getting through SAMe and recycling. So that's, I guess, what I'm seeing now too, is like a couple of those ahas, like, you know, these people, it's bad enough that they have these things, but now we're not even getting a little bit of an income generated with these upper problems. So maybe let's talk about that and how that plays into it and what you're seeing with that.
Yeah, kind of the same thing, because you're talking about, you know, there's some people that cross over into different, you know, into like multiple genetic types, where maybe they have this weak immune type, but they're also that understimulated type where they do have methylation and impairment. Because, you know, all these things we talk about like these 7 core genetic types, we talk about these genes, and we kind of preface these that they're like in isolation. They're kind of like on their own islands, individual of one another. And they all play into this stuff. So when you're talking about NRF2, KEAP1 activity, you're talking about autophagy aspects. It's like you need certain processes in the body to be able to function properly, to be able to regulate those things. So when you're talking about, you know, mTOR components, you know, we know that histamine and mast cell components can be something that stimulates that process. And so then if you've got issues with histamine on top of it, but furthermore, if you've got problems with methylation activity, and methylation activity is going to cause impairment in histamine, that in itself is going to feed into this whole mTOR and autophagy story. And so that is how some of these things are connected. And there's so many different things. And we talk about, this isn't kind of linear. This isn't like 2-dimensional. This is something that is, you know, 3-dimensional. And it's like, you know, all this stuff kind of interconnects with it. And then sometimes, you know, we get too linear in our thinking with this, but unfortunately, to make sense of this and have starting points, we have to, you know, and we have to kind of categorize where this starting point is to really simplify this down. And a lot of times when you categorize and simplify this down and get a starting point, that gets the ball rolling. And in some people, that's basically maybe all they need to do. But when you talk about somebody that's got a lot going on, you have crossover in multiple genetic types that have to be addressed. And if you don't do that, you don't get the needle going in the right direction, okay? Because these things are interconnected in everybody at some level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, John. If you kind of boil it down into simplicity, when you have some challenges with those MTHFR, MTR, BHMT, SAMe production, it's understimulated, right? You're not getting enough gas in the tank. So you kind of have to, you know, that's where the art of what we do comes in, right? Because, you know, if we know that they have some major immune challenges, they have major lipid peroxidation and their free radicals are just outweighing their antioxidants, what's the art of, you know, giving them some gas in the tank on the methylation side of things when they're understimulated, and then also supporting their inflammation and their peroxidation and their antioxidants. So maybe let's talk about that. So let's say I'm listening to this, I'm kind of lost. You guys are using big words. You know, you just started with like, I know my immune system is always weakened. I'm always getting a cold. I haven't really taken the genetic type test yet, but I can really relate with that. Plus, I know I may have MTHFR. So what do I do about it? I guess that's a great talk.
Yeah. So you have to know the players. And I use the example all the time, and you kind of, you know, led into that side of it. the art of this, right? And so understanding your genetics, understanding your genetic type, understanding if you are the weak immunotype, understanding if you have MTHFR and you have some of the other factors that kind of falls into the understimulated type, understanding the genetic type and these gene mutations and these epigenetic stressors is vital. Because if you correlate this to understanding all the players on the field, all right? So by understanding genetic components, epigenetic factors, by taking our genetics unlocked course and understanding how to determine what genetic type you are, what are the key gene SNPs, how do you test the relevance, how do you start supporting that, okay? You're gonna understand some of the players that are on the field. Now, the hard part or the art part of it is, what plays do you run? You know, how do you orchestrate that? All right. So a lot of times the frustrating thing is people are doing a lot of things. A lot of people know a lot of the players on the field already. They've got the players. They're missing a couple. They're missing the genetic component. They're missing what their genetic type is, which is going to put the remaining of the players on the field, which then now allows them to have the full team out there. Now we just got to figure out, how do we run the plays? What plays do we run? How do we maybe have to do this way or this way to make it effectively? And there's no wrong or right way, or there's no exact kind of, recipe to do this. But once you know how your genetic predisposition and these epigenetic factors cross correlate, you're going to have the information, the tools to be able to now say, I can play around and determine, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that play, because you know all the players involved, so that now you can start getting the needle going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, John. And a lot of times I'll say too, I heard this from Dr. Marshall from PRL saying, when you learn the players, you can move from the defense to the offense, right? And I think like you kind of have to work on the defense, because if you're calling a doc like John and I, and a lot of, the cases get more and more complicated, it's not just a matter of getting some methylation in the gas in the tank because you're undermethylated or understimulated. You got a lot of inflammation at the end of the day. So I guess a couple of those plays are just, making sure that you go into zone defense, right? So you don't get the ball thrown over your head. And that really comes down to the inflammatory response. And I think that's pretty good with everyone, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, and to kind of use that example, and to kind of tie this back into the weak immune type, we talk about NRF2 and KEAP1 activity. A lot of people that have an autoimmune issue, or they kind of read things and maybe they're, taking glutathione, right? Because that's something that they feel or told they need to do because they have an autoimmune process. Now that may be fine and dandy, but maybe they don't know the whole story. They don't know all the players on the field that deal with glutathione. And so we're talking about having glutathione, but also how does genetic factors like NRF2 and KEAP1 play into how our body utilizes or recognizes when to release the glutathione to kind of fight the fight. Sometimes that's where the problem lies. And you can have all the glutathione in the world, but if you've got KEAP1 gene variants and your body doesn't recognize that there's an issue going on, that you need to release the glutathione, well, you're not going to really accomplish what you set out to accomplish. And I know we've used kind of that sprinkler analogy with that, on how NRF2 and KEAP1 and glutathione kind of play into that weak immune response. And that's a great example that really gets into talking about like knowing all the players. And if you're missing one of those players, you're that close, but you're just missing one piece of the puzzle that is going to allow things to really take off for you. Do you want to explain that sprinkler analogy with the NRF2 and KEAP1?
Yeah, it's a great analogy, John, too, where basically you have the burning building and you have the sprinkler system and the signaler or the trip wire to be able to release the water is that KEAP1, right? And I think maybe you can explain how the NRF2 kind of ties into that, because KEAP1's upstream, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if you look at it, if you're talking about inflammation in the body, because everything goes back to inflammation at some level. How do you control inflammation? Well, your antioxidants, your glutathione is the master antioxidant that really aids in controlling inflammation. So when you have a fire going on in the body, you have inflammation, you want to put the fire out. So we use that burning building analogy. If you got a burning building, you want the sprinkler system that has been laid down on the foundation of that building to release the water to put that fire out, or at least control it until somebody can get there to help manage it, right? So the two components of this is there's genetic factors to deal with this, all right, that never a lot of times are explained. Everybody's so stuck on just glutathione, or you're deficient, let's add it. But a lot of people have adequate glutathione levels. It's just that they can't release the water adequately to control the fire. And so there's two components. There's NRF2 and there's KEAP1. KEAP1, like you mentioned, is that's kind of the signaling aspect. That's the gene that recognizes that there's a fire in the first place. If you have genetic issues with KEAP1 and you got plenty of glutathione, you're never going to recognize that there's a fire burning in the first place to release the water. You got plenty of water in the pipes in the ceiling, but the KEAP1 gene is offline. And so there's smoke, there's fire, but that sensor on that sprinkler is not working. That water never gets released. Building's going to burn down. The NRF2 component deals with where are the sprinklers placed. Okay, so if I'm in a room right now and I've got a sprinkler, I look up and there's sprinklers in the ceiling here, and there's a fire that breaks down in this room, at least I've got sprinklers in here. So I'm going to release water in this room. Where the problem lies, if in the next room we forgot to put sprinklers in the ceiling there, and that's where the fire breaks out, and now that fire is raging so much, by the time it gets to the room I'm in that has sprinklers, it's too late. The building's going to burn down. So when people have weakness with NRF2 activity, it's almost like they were designed where they didn't get enough sprinkler heads put in. It's like they got a sprinkler in the liver, but they forgot to put it in the pancreas. So if the fire's in the pancreas, guess what? Body's going to break down. And so that's where this whole kind of weakened immune genetic type comes in, because a lot of people we see that have autoimmune issues or have chronic symptoms and there's a immune system connection, they have some dysregulation in how they can control inflammation, how they can put the fire out. And it's more than just glutathione. It's, do they have adequate sprinkler heads throughout the building? Do they have the sensor online, or is it basically the switch is turned off and they don't recognize there's a fire going on in the first place? I see that with a lot of people with chronic viral and chronic Lyme issues, that there's not enough sprinkler heads, the sensor's turned off, they got normal glutathiones, they're still taking glutathione, and it's like they don't feel any different, right? You got to get all those pieces working together. You got to get all the players on the field. And that's something that's great about, you know, the unlock course, is we kind of walk through and talk about those things. And not only these are things to look at, these are things you test for it, these are things you can do for it. And here's the thing, NRF2 is not new. There's research articles back in the 70s in the medical literature on NRF2. Most people, I bet, that are listening to this are doing or have done things that support NRF2 activity. One of the biggest things that supports NRF2 is turmeric or curcumin. You know, and I take it all that time. And I say, well, why are you taking that? Well, I heard it controls inflammation. Well, I heard it, you know, prevents cancer. Well, what it's doing is this is supporting your NRF2. It's getting the sprinkler system in tune. It's making sure you have adequate sprinkler heads dropped everywhere in the body, so that when you need to release the water, when their fire breaks out, you're able to release the water to control the fire. Okay. And that's something that I see a lot, that people with this weak immune genetic type that have autoimmune issues, that aren't responding, that maybe have MTHFR and taking methylfolate, there's more to it. They have issues with this whole NRF2 KEAP1 glutathione story, or they have problems with that mTOR autophagy story, or they have a combination of both.
And the methylation up top too.
And the methylation up top that feeds into all of it.
Yeah. And, you know, there's a couple clinical pearls in there, John, which you alluded to, which, you know, if people are getting their organic acid test, or even they have it on the Dutch test now, where they look at their glutathione markers, they all look normal.
Right. All the
so,
time.
You know, it's like, it's a head scratcher. And then people say, okay, well, I guess you don't need to, you know, work on, let's throw that out and cross that off our list.
All the time.
Yeah. And so, you know, looking, and I don't even know. So really, we're talking about NRF2 and KEAP1 is KEAP1. I don't even know, John, are those on the new cards for the 23andMe and Ancestry, or are they not?
They are not, no. So that's the thing is when Ancestry or when 23andMe went to version 5, they took a lot of things off. So some of these things are not on those tests, you know, especially the ones that we know are the big players in this. And that's where, you know, looking at some other tests that are available that, you know, are really cost effective for the amount of information that's in there, like the functional genomic analysis that we use and recommend, is definitely the way to go. Because if you've done 23andMe, or you at least maybe been told you have MTHFR, and you know there's a genetic connection, and you have Hashimoto's, or you have chronic fatigue or adrenal fatigue aspects, and you know you take our course and you realize, hey, I'm this weak immune type, what's the next steps? Well, you got to figure out, do you have these genetic and these genes that are involved? Because then if you have that information, now you know those players on the field, and now you know what you can do to address that. Because you mentioned the organic acid, the Dutch. All the time I see people that every single week, somebody that maybe has had an organic acids test or a Dutch test ran by another practitioner, their glutathione markers are normal, and basically they're inflamed, they have an autoimmune issue or multiple autoimmune issues. I'm like, that makes no sense. Your body should be burning through that glutathione. You should be deficient. Why is your body not burning through it? And usually there's genetic components like this of why the body says, hey, I've got plenty of water in the pipes ready to go, but your body isn't recognizing that there's a fire going on.
Right. Yeah. And that's where obviously getting the functional genomic analysis test is going to fill in those blind spots.
Yeah. And that's something people can get. Some people can get. They can go to yourgenetictype.com and they can order that test right from our store. You know, something they don't have to work with a practitioner. They have to, you know, work with us. That's something they can get that test, get the results back, you know, listen to this or take our Unlock course. It's $97, learn that information and start connecting the dots on their own. And that's why we put that course together, is so somebody can get educated and start kind of laying that groundwork. All right. And then when they get stuck, then they reach out to a practitioner or reach out to somebody like us, and they have done a lot of the work. We don't have to kind of start out foundational things because they've got all the players in the field. They just need us to help orchestrate what plays to run.
Yeah, and that's really our mission. I think, John, I don't think we've ever actually overtly put out the mission out there, but I think that is the mission, right? Yeah. Is in terms of just making it, because everyone who listens to this is sophisticated, right? And they've had to trump their doctors who don't tell them that there's anything beyond MTHFR, if they even just tell them that there's MTHFR. And they realize, okay, my blood tests aren't normal. I know I've been told that they are, but I still feel, you know, that I'm run down. I feel like I'm old. I feel like I'm puffy. I feel like I'm swelling. I feel like I get sick all the time. And then basically I, you know, at the same time, I spent thousands of dollars and talked to a lot of different practitioners who haven't moved the needle. And so now we have this resource at yourgenetictype.com where you can take the free course. You can pay a low hanging offer in terms of $97. And in fact, if you know you sign up for the course, we give a discount on that. So that, I mean, it can be as low as, you know, $74. And then from there, we have the ability to purchase the tests on your own. And then when you purchase the test, again, you don't necessarily have to go out and hire a doc. You can just do the work on your own. And then the best part of that, which I'm assuming we'll start for December, right, is the membership course.
Yep.
And the membership is included for your first month. And basically that's where Dr. John and I will have a bi-monthly, so twice a month, sort of a case study. So we can get into these specific nuances, right? Like in terms of, hey, like you had this come back on your genetic test. You're this genetic type. What do I do about it? These are the case studies that Dr. John and I are opening up for you, going over some of the challenges that we had, like epigenetically, like, hey, this is what, you know, also put fuel on the fire. So it wasn't as simple and straightforward as you got a NRF2 or a KEAP1, even though your organic acid test was normal. Well, there was this whole other, you know, iron ferritin that was over 300 that also mucked up the waters too. So that's really cool stuff. I think those tests are available now on our site. Am I correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So okay. And then as far as there was something else that I wanted to mention in there that we had, but I think you talked about most of it. Any little clinical pearls besides, you know, if you look at your organic acid test and your glutathione looks normal, don't cross it off your list. Go look at your specific genetic test and see if you have a KEAP1 or NRF2. Maybe is there any other clinical pearls? I know I got another one, so if you don't have one, I'll come up with another one.
Go and give us another one.
Well, no, the other one is a lot of the times people, like I've had people do really poorly, like they look at their genetic types and they look at their gene SNPs, and then they do like the SOD and they do the catalase. And I've had a lot of like really, as you would call it, like a Herxheiming reaction where it was like a head scratcher and like, what the heck? And then again, looking at the NRF2 keep one, looking at the, obviously the recycling of glutathione, because if that glutathione is not there to be able to pick up all that extra hydrogen peroxide that you're dumping into the system, they do really poorly. Have you seen that a lot too?
Yeah, I learned that a couple of years ago pretty quickly, looking at SOD gene mutations and putting somebody on SOD by itself and them feeling a lot worse, and then having to go back to the pathways and be like, oh, we just probably created a whole bunch more hydrogen peroxide, and let's maybe focus on clearing that first, because if people have listened to us, they know how we kind of feel about iron, and how iron can, be a huge inflammatory as well as copper. So if you got all this excess hydrogen peroxide and you got some of those unbound minerals that are there, that's something that can really create a lot of nasty inflammation. So that's another thing too, is a lot of, and that's, I always, and to kind of add to that, like we were talking about taking SOD and catalase and feeling worse, and saying you have to kind of come back and look at the glutathione peroxidation or recycling side of things. I always tell patients, when you're talking about genetic aspects and talking about supporting these pathways, okay, you want a change. All right. So if somebody looks at their gene SNPs and they say that I have a bunch of SOD mutations or variants, and they take SOD and they feel worse, well, it's information. They move the needle. It's just they moved it in a direction that further downstream, there's some other stories that got to be addressed. All you did is you took peroxynitrite and most likely cleared it in a hydrogen peroxide, but there's some other steps in the story. So, sometimes people get frustrated and they take the SOD and they feel worse. They're like, well, it's not SOD, it's not genetics. Well, it's like, no, it is SOD, but maybe you have excess iron, or maybe you have that NRF2 or keep one story or glutathione peroxidation aspects. It's like, if you get the needle moving in a direction or you get a change, you're affecting your biochemistry. And we're talking about the genetic component, we're talking about affecting your biochemistry. So sometimes adverse responses gives you information. And so, in our Unlock course, you kind of learn some of those things where it's like, okay, if this happens, look at the pathway. You probably need to maybe pick up and support this a little bit more aggressively to offset that response that you had to that. So that's a great kind of point that you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, two good blog titles, John. Why SOD made you worse, and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when you have a bad response, because ultimately, like you said, it's information. And I tell people I work with too, that's great news, right? We can figure that out. And I think the third thing about that is that you have practitioners like us who have, like you said, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, ran into these same pitfalls and had to look back into the biochemistry books and figure out why, right? And so that's what you're doing, is you're leapfrogging ahead of all those mistakes that you would make on your own. And you're not a doctor, or you're just wanting to get back to your health and get back into your life, and you're doing a lot of work. So let us take all that burden off your hands and be able to give you these little cheat sheets that we're looking at. And I think that's good. Maybe the last one also too, John, would be that cheat sheet with SHMT and glycine. Maybe give us a quick little 30-second or your commercial on that one.
What's that from a glycine standpoint in terms of
just, I guess, if you're
production,
yeah, I mean, if you see people have that SHMT SNP and they are a weak immune type, and they have some challenges with NRF2, how that would muck up the waters even further.
Yeah, because you're talking about what SHMT is. SHMT is a gene that makes glycine. And so when you're talking about glycine production, glycine is one of the 3 amino acids that is needed to make glutathione. And so that is something that maybe somebody with an organic acids test that has low glutathione levels, okay, may have SHMT variants, but they can't make it. So yes, you can supplement with glutathione and skip those steps, but you also want to help the body be able to make its own. And so then you're talking about taking glycine, taking amino acids to help the body make its own production, or start making its own, rather than being so dependent on exogenous sources all the time. So SHMT, you know, a lot of times a big player. I have a lot of patients that really respond well to glycine because of what it does for you know, folate recycling and how it feeds in the biopterin in terms of you know, neurotransmitters or brain chemistry that deals with mood aspects. I have a lot of patients that have autoimmune issues that fall into this weak immune type that do have low glutathione levels and their immune system's taxed out, and they just don't have enough ingredients to make the antioxidants, and they start taking the glycine, and now they can make the glutathione, and now their body can fight the fight, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think another one that you sort of turned me on to even further too. So that's awesome. So good stuff, John. So bottom line is just the yourgenetictype.com, being able to get that free course. Then from there, being able to go into the paid course. And then from there, being able to go into the membership. And I guess starting now, being able to go into to the shop and be able to get access to the different tests, whether you know, organic. I think organic acid test is probably a test we recommended for all types, no?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it really marries really nicely with genetics in general. And you talk about really each genetic type that there is, you know, except for maybe the histamine type. Although there's things in the organic acids that deal with like methylation activity and things of that nature that kind of fall into that. But all the genetic types, the organic acids gives you information that correlates nicely with those gene SNPs that fall into, you know, all 7 core genetic types.
Yeah, and what's nice is you can plug that into that software too, right? So it gives you a little more insight on the objective, giving you just more insight on what specific area you want to go to. So awesome content today, John. Sorry you didn't get that email earlier this morning.
That's all right.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, that's good, but you kind of had, you know, you just sort of winged it, and we get good conversation. And that's it. So we'll have to figure out what our next one will be. And every Tuesday we do this at 3 p.m. And we look forward to, you know, giving you the support you need to ultimately get your health back and get back into the game. Any other things you want to add?
Nope. I just encourage people to go to yourgenetictype.com, check out the website, and take the Genetics Unlocked course. It's definitely something that's going to change your life. Awesome. All right, John. Hey, hopefully you're feeling a little bit better. Looks like you lost a little bit of weight, huh? Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you later. All right. See you later. Bye. Bye.